Hi, I'm Kelly McKnight of New Belgium Brewing Company. I'm the lead research and development mint brewer. And this is the Brewer to Brewer podcast from All About Beer. My guest today is Dick Cantwell, and he is here for a conversation that goes beyond the brew house and into topics that matter to brewing professionals and curious beer drinkers. But first, let's pause and
Time to add a kick of color. Blue butterfly flower is a natural, flavorless flower that gives beers an attractive violet or
please visit
amethyst hue.
allaboutbeer.com and follow on
Contact
social
First
media
Tea to
at All
discover
About
blue
Beer and support
butterfly and other
journalism in the
natural
beer
botanicals
space.
that
Check
deliver
out
color,
patreon.com
fragrance,
slash
and
allaboutbeer.
flavor. Email info at firsttea, that's FIRSDTEA.com to find out more.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media at Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customer success at malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malt Europe, premium grains from field to
Okay,
flavor.
let's get into it. A bit about my guest today is we are interviewing Dick Cantwell. Dick Cantwell was co-founder of Elysian Brewing in Seattle in 1996, where he was named the Large Brewpub Brewer of the Year 3 times at Great American Beer Fest. He received the Russell Shearer Award for Innovation and Excellence in Brewing in 2004, and has published 4 books related to brewing, including Barley Wine, along with Val Allen, Wood and Beer, along with Peter Buchart, Eclectic IPA, and the Brewers Association Guide to Starting Your Own Brewery. He is also an internationally recognized beer judge and now lives in San Francisco and Western Sonoma County in California, where these days he homebrews with his friends in his barn. Welcome, Dick.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. It's been, just a few weeks, so
Right.
missed you. Okay, so Dick, I'm glad you could make it, and I'm going to keep this pretty casual. But let's start off with people who don't know or maybe are curious about your origins. You are a very interesting person. You've done a lot and you've traveled the world. But I'd like to start with when you first started homebrewing, what got you into beer? What was your inspiration?
Well, I mean, years before I actually even started homebrewing, my introduction to Belgian beer came sort of oddly enough through my ex-wife. She was an art historian, still is an art historian. She was eventually the chief curator at the Seattle Art Museum. And in those days, she was a graduate student and her field was Flemish painting. So we would go to Belgium and look at art. And while I was there, of course, since I was always into beer, I would notice these things that I'd never heard of and try as many things as I possibly could. And then it wasn't until a few years later that I actually started homebrewing, because a buddy of mine just suggests he had taken a homebrewing class. And so he and a couple of other people, a couple other guys, and I would get together, I don't know, every so often to brew a batch of beer. And what really sort of propelled me was that, I'm a writer, of course, published those beer books and all that kind of stuff. And I also want to talk about my writing later too, a bit. But anyway, so I had always spent my days writing, trying to write fiction, and with varying success, although I never did publish any of it. And when my daughter was born, I always wrote during the days and worked in restaurants at night. When my daughter was born, I stayed home and took care of her for about a year and a half. And I just didn't have the time to write the way I had. And I had started homebrewing, and I found that, you know, the homebrewing, the little bits and pieces of what you have to do to homebrew, transferring, bottling, and all that kind of stuff, I could do while I was taking care of her. So it was something that was creative that kept me going that way. And also, you know, I was responsible as a father. But, you know, I just kind of got maniacal about it and decided to try to get a job, because she got a job. My ex-wife got a job in Seattle, and we moved from Cambridge, where I had started homebrewing, out west, and that was in 1990. And I took a mixed 6-pack of my beers around to every brewery in town, and I actually was offered 2 jobs, and that's how I started.
Okay, so you started brewing, which that's also a great background. Thank you for sharing that. Now, you became a brewer, but then you opened one of the world's kind of most famous breweries. What was the landscape like in the 90s, and why were you crazy enough to actually leave and open a brewery?
Well, yeah. I mean, I remember talking to Bill Owens on the phone one time, and this was when I worked at Big Time Brewery and Ale House in the U District in Seattle before we started Elysian. We were working on the business plan, but hadn't opened it yet. And at that point, there were probably a few hundred breweries in the country. And I remember Bill saying, you know what? There's going to be 1,000 of them before you know it. And of course, now there are 10,000 or whatever it is. But you know, we all knew each other, and you know, it's literally, I mean, and also we were a lot younger. So if there was a brewers night anywhere in town in Seattle, we all went. All the brewers were there. And you know, you can't possibly keep that pace up forever. But it was a really tight community, and there were fewer of us, and we all stayed in touch. And you know, we'd meet brewers from Portland and from Vancouver up north and all that kind of stuff. And it just felt like a really great community. And of course, Colorado and so many of the other hotbeds. And I stayed in touch with a lot of the people that I knew in New England as well, and still do.
Cool. Now, okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. Elysian has opened. You guys are doing great. What styles were when you kind of were the first few years in? What beer styles? What were you looking for? How did you know what to make that people would drink? I mean, I know, and I reference that because today's crazy different than it was in your inaugural year and early years.
Well,
So yeah,
yeah, I mean, I had the advantage of working in a brew pub, you know, what had been Seattle's most popular brew pub, Big Time. And that was the best brewing job in Seattle until I started Elysian and made myself a better one. But, you know, I had the advantage of being able to try out a lot of recipes and see what I thought worked and what I enjoyed doing and what I wanted to bring out to people, and some of the experimenting things that I did as well. So when we started, I knew we wanted to have, the first beer we brewed was our ESB, the Wise, which was kind of based on a beer that I used to brew at Big Time that was called Rainfest, and also with a nod to Celebration Ale. And then we also made an Imperial Oatmeal Stout, the Dragon's Tooth. And those were 2 of our most successful beers back then. And we also had to have an IPA, because when I had worked at Pike Place Brewery with all those guys there, Fal Allen, Kevin Forehand, Bill Jenkins, we did, I think it was the first sort of production IPA in Seattle. You know, and we just made it 3.5 barrels at a time. And we were allowed to use some American hops because Charles Finkel, the owner of the brewery, he loved everything English, but we begged and he let us put some Chinook hops in it. But we didn't brew it that often. So I wanted to have an everyday IPA. And so that was what became the Immortal, which by today's standards, and even the standards by the time I left Elysian, was a pretty mainstream, probably maltier than almost anything these days, but still, you know, for the time, it was fairly hoppy. And then of course we moved on from there. But, you know, I tried a lot of things, you know, and we had a 20 barrel system, which was kind of enormously large for a brew pub at the time. And, I'll be honest, I mean, sometimes some of the more esoteric things hung heavily on our hands, like when I made 20 barrels of wild rice beer and, it stuck around for a while. It wasn't all that great after a couple of months.
Was it a lager or an ale?
It was a lager. And I wanted to do it right. I wanted to gelatinize the starches in the wild rice, but there was no literature about that. I mean, I talked to some of my other northern Midwestern brewing friends because I'm from Minnesota. And I talked to Grant Johnston, who was then at Marin. He was from Wisconsin. Terry Ferendorf, of course, who was at Steelhead back then. She was from Wisconsin. We all made wild rice beers. So I asked their advice, and Terry sent me some stuff about starch gelatinization. And I used to go through this complicated, basically, do a small mash of the wild rice with a percentage of malt just for some enzymes and gradually crank it up and drag it through the temperature range to, I hoped, gelatinize the starches, but I didn't know.
What, in your opinion, how did the beer taste?
When it was fresh, it was really good. But 3 months later, it's kind of fallen apart. But wild rice was expensive too, and I never really shrank from spending money on ingredients. And I remember asking one of my then partners, who was the business guy, I was like, well, I said, so how much was that wild rice? So he never even told me how much it was. But he called into question not just brewing with wild rice in the future, but brewing lagers at all, because with the tank time, they were more expensive. They represented more cost. But that, I don't want to get too much into those dynamics, but
Well, you did write a book on starting your own brewery, so I can handle a little bit of that. Real quick, I want to touch back on your IPA. You were one of the first people brewing an American IPA, and were people into it? I mean, did it?
Oh, yeah.
Did people?
Oh yeah, it was far and away our most popular beer.
Okay, so Northwest. That's pretty cool. I mean, and I just want to say, if anybody listening doesn't know, Dick Cantwell obviously is one of the most esteemed brewers, not only in the US, but around the world. And so everything you're saying, even though we are just friends, I want to say that people should be really taking in what you have and the knowledge that you're sharing with us. So enough of that. But this is very impressive, and I know I get to see you sometimes in person and here, but you've seen it all and done it all, so this is really cool. All right, so you opened Elysian, you started making some really cool beers. What were some of the wildest fun times you had during your Elysian tenure?
Well, one thing that I think was really interesting that we did was that it was partly because of our corporate structure. We had some British investors, one of whom was David Bruce, who started the Firkin chain in Britain. And because we had some foreign investors, we had to be a C Corp rather than an S Corp. And what that means is that for us to dividend, everything would have been double taxed. All the taxes on the income from the business would be taken into account, and then each individual investor would be responsible for paying further taxes. So there was kind of a disincentive for us to actually dividend, which is why we kept opening breweries. And as we kept opening breweries, we had all these breweries with different sizes. So we had Tangletown had a 3-barrel brewery. Elysian Fields, despite the fact that it's 500 seats, had just a 10-barrel brewery. But we were able to supply shift them around from location to location, so I could tailor, how crazy the beers were to the size that I was brewing. So at Tangletown, I had all sorts of freedom to come up with beers. I think I was the first one to brew with yuzu. I know I was the first one to use Sriracha Ace hops because Darren Gamache called me up and said they had this new hop variety and they were going to send them all to me. And would I do some experiments? Stuff like that. So, my friend Fal, of course, went off at a certain point, to brew in Singapore for 5 years. And so he came back from Singapore and we brewed all the test batches for the exotic beers that he was going to do there because we could do something that was appropriately sized. We did a tamarind saison and we did a hefeweizen with lemongrass and all that various other tropical flavorings. And there was something else that I'm not remembering right now. But it was really great to have that little brewery as sort of a lab to try out some of these things. And that was where I first brewed the Jasmine IPA that we did too, which was a product of, honestly, I mean, I've told the story a million times, but the very first time I judged at GABF, Mark Dorber, who then ran the White Horse in London, really loved one of the IPAs we were judging. And he said it reminded him of jasmine tea. And I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And a few years later, I got to try to do that. And that was actually the only medal Tangletown ever won, but I was very proud of that. To have that freedom to try crazy little things like that.
I'm going to tell you that beer, your Jasmine IPA, when I moved from Seattle over to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you are very familiar, I'm sure, with this bar, but Red Bones, it was the first year I was there, and there's a bar called Red Bones in Somerville, and they had like a Northwest Fest, and leading up to it, and I wasn't even a brewer yet, I was still just in grad school, but I craved, anything I could get from the Northwest, and they, sure enough, they actually brought in a firkin of that, and you saved my life, so thank you.
Those were fun. Those were really fun fests, what the Red Bones people did.
Yeah, they were great. Cool. So yeah, and then if you want, Fowl came back and brought all these crazy ingredients. Was that just, pure joy starting to see all these things you could work with that you may have not thought of before?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Fowl, I should say, he used to have parties. He's from Hawaii. And he used to have parties where he would brew a beer using everything in the house that was fermentable. And he would have it out in a bucket, and you had to drink it out of a coconut shell. And it had everything, the syrup from a can of peaches, I don't think he ever put ketchup in, but that has stabilizers anyway. But it had all sorts of stuff. And he put in a ton of hops, of course, so it would be palatable. But, so I think it kind of came naturally to him to come up with some of these tropical things, which was totally up my alley too. So that was fun.
Cool. I think we should bring that ritual back.
Well, yeah, Fowl would always wear a sarong too, but whatever.
Whatever. So something about you that people might not know, is that you are a big music lover. And I know that just because we're buddies. But I was wondering if and especially you living later on in the Seattle scene, did music have any influence on your career or how you design beers or maybe artists you worked with?
Well, I don't know about, the music directly inspiring beer. I mean, but, I was really fortunate in that, yes, I lived in Seattle. I moved to Seattle as the grunge years were really taking hold. But I also graduated from college in the late 70s when punk rock was really catching on too. So I was really fortunate to coincide with a couple of really great, chapters in musical history. And, music has always just been really, really important to me anyway, listening and all that kind of stuff. And I always tried to tie in with some of the artists that we had in Seattle. And, back in those early days, a bunch of people who were in the bands also worked at breweries. And so also when you'd go to shows and stuff like that, or just little informal performances and stuff, there was always craft beer there because somebody worked there or they knew somebody who worked at a brewery. And then when everybody got older, that sort of stopped being the case because they didn't all work in breweries anymore. They didn't have the inns to get free beer from breweries. And the breweries got bigger too and got a little more officious. So the scene got a little less interdependent that way. But in those early years, there really was a lot of overlap to all the exciting things that were happening in Seattle between music and coffee and beer and movies and all sorts of stuff. Then later on, we did a beer with Sub Pop. I wanted to make beers with some of the local alternative cultural institutions. So we did a beer with Sub Pop called Loser. And that was one of the first things that AB cut when they took over. But we also did a couple of collaborations with Fantagraphics Books that does graphic novels and that kind of stuff. with a couple of artists who did labels for the beers and helped sort of like I did have some interaction with them for inspiration. One thing I never got around to, because this one artist that we worked with drew a picture of what he envisioned a beer made with alfalfa would be. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to do that. But I never did. So I didn't get around to everything, but it was really fun sort of feeding off of each other. And music was part of that. The graphic novels were part of it. You know, I've had so many friends in the coffee business. You know, I wrote a thing for the Malt, the Beer Advocate at one point, comparing the world of coffee and craft beer. And, you know, because it always struck me that the coffee people were far less willing to share their ideas with each other because they were afraid they were going to steal from each other. And, you know, of course, we do that all the time. I mean, it's kind of a tenet of craft brewing is that we share everything. But, you know, I've always said it's the nature of the beverage. You know, if you drink 5 beers, you're probably going to get a little too friendly with the person sitting next to you, where if you drink 5 cups of coffee, you're not going to be able to meet their eye.
Good point. Good point. That's really cool. That's something that it sounds like a cool time back then, working with, you know, all those people. And today craft breweries are still trying to do the same thing and share ideas. But I also, you know, we talked about your relationship with music and beer. What about, you know, you touched in the beginning that you were a writer. What about your relationship with writing? And then does that play into beer for you?
Sure it does. I mean, I'd certainly get inspiration for names from writing, from reading and writing. But as I said, you know, I was a writer long before I was a brewer. I mean, that was always my plan coming out of college. I was going to try to become a successful novelist. And that didn't really work out, but I did write a couple of novels, and that was good training. And then, you know, as I mentioned, I was supporting myself by working in restaurants, but I found that I could only do that for so long. I did it for 10 years, you know, waiting tables and bartending. And so becoming a brewer was supposed to be my escape from the restaurant business. But then within several years, I owned 4 restaurants or something. But I wasn't waiting tables anymore. I was at least supplying the beer for it. But you know, these days I have the freedom to do that again. And I'm doing it in a much different way. I'm not trying to become a successful novelist anymore. I have no idea what will happen to any of the writing that I'm doing, but I'm asking less of myself in terms of word output per day, and also planning less, which I find is really gratifying and a lot of fun. So, but yeah, as I say, you know, there's a lot of inspiration for names that from obscure literary sources, and I'm nothing without my obscure sources.
Is there anything that you're working on right now that you can talk about?
Well, I'm working on a novel, but you know, I don't like to talk too much about projects that I'm partway through on because it's easy to talk them out and never get it written. I mean, it's sort of superstitious that way. I mean, it's almost as though if you explain too much about something, it'll never make it onto the page. But also, as I said, I'm planning less. So I mean, yes, I do know some of the things that are going to happen into the future. And I would say in terms of page output, I'm about half done with it. Obviously, there'll be editing and all that kind of stuff too. But, you know, it's not a particular genre. You know, it's not a detective story. It's not science fiction or anything like that. But it does take advantage of a lot of the experiences that I've had. And it's not about brewing either. But, you know, there is reference to I have to say there's a lot of restaurant stuff in it because that's a really fun and funny thing to make fun of. So there's that. And, you know, the characters are whatever, drawn from wherever. I'm not going to get too specific about any of that. But we have a lot going on here on our ranch and stuff. So I don't have a lot of time to spend on it. And I didn't really want to get back into the sort of writing 6 hours a day kind of routine that I used to do. So if I can get 200 words done in a day, I'm perfectly happy. Usually it's more than that. You know, but I start to feel uncomfortable if it gets to be more than 500 or 600 words. And I used to try to write like 6 pages a day. And I think I was moving too fast. I think it's much better to move slower, to be a little more deliberate, and at the same time more improvisational to make it a more interesting project.
So I couldn't even imagine. I can barely write my name down on a piece of paper. Let alone a beer recipe. I shouldn't say that. All right. So we know you're a great writer and you've written 4 beer books. Now, maybe let's go back to the first brewing book or brewing industry book you wrote. How does that happen? Do you get approached? Do you come up with the idea? What do you do?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Fal and I, we worked together at what was then called the Pike Place Brewery and later became Pike Brewing Company when they moved into a different building and weren't allowed to use that name anymore, which is kind of silly. But anyway, so we worked together from 91 to 94 there, and Fal was the head brewer. I was the number 3 brewer. Kevin Forehand was had seniority over me. I used to refer to that as a chronological accident, that he was ahead of me in the hierarchy. But anyway, so we all worked together. And so I realized at a certain point that I was never going to be the head brewer there. And so I wanted to try to make a name for myself. And so I started, and since I was a writer, I started, kept putting out inquiries for articles and stuff like that. So Fal and Kevin and I wrote what was kind of a groundbreaking article at the time about how to make cask beer using regular American hardware, kegs and stuff like that for brewing techniques. So we did that. And I wrote for, what else? A local thing called the Pint Post. I wrote some stuff for the Celebrator Beer News. But, I really wanted to get my name out there and make a name for myself because I wasn't going to be in charge of the brewery. And I eventually moved on and became in charge of other breweries and then started Elysian, of course. But that was sort of how that started. And then this was my version of the story. And then once I started doing that, Fal decided he wanted to do that too, because he wanted to be, known as a writer as well. So whatever. But we did decide that we were going to work on a book together. And we decided, since we brewed a barley wine every year at Pike Place and had learned about that we would pick that style for that series of style books that Brewers Publications was putting out during those years. And so we would go to these at the Oregon Brewers Festival, the GABF, whatever else. We would kind of crash. I mean, we were semi-legitimate, but we would kind of crash these literary gatherings where all the beer writers would get together. And there were the various editors from the magazines and all that kind of stuff. And we would look around the room, and I'd say, you talk to her, I'll talk to him. And we would work the room trying to find opportunities for our writing. And eventually we pitched the idea of doing the barley wine book together to Brewers Publications, and they bit, and we did that. But that's how that came about. We weren't approached. We kind of made that happen. But later on, I was approached for the other books. But for that first one, we totally had to make that from the ground up.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I like that. I mean, I like that it ties into what you were trying to do originally to make a name for yourself through literature. And then, you both work in the room. You wrote your barley wine book. What was research like for that? Did you just drink a lot of barley wine? Did you?
Well, yes, incidentally. We did a trip to England, of course. And we visited some of the, key places, like we went to see where the brewery that they were making the Thomas Hardy Ale in, and we went to Portsmouth, where they make Gale's Prize Old Ale, various other things, various other stops on the way. And we went to the Great British Beer Festival, which of course is a great opportunity to try all styles of beer, in addition to barley wines. And we got access to the archives of this place and that place. We went up to Bass and we got access to their archives to look at the old brew sheets for Bass number 1, because that was the first acknowledged commercial barley wine that was available anywhere in the world. And that was cool, going through those old logs.
Did you have to? I mean, how could you possibly get access to those archives?
Well, we would write to them and ask, and they were very, very nice. But I mentioned Mark Dorber earlier. In those years, he was running the White Horse in Parsons Green, which was a very craft-friendly bass pub. And he now has a place in Walberswick with an inn and a restaurant and stuff. And then he was opening, last time I was there, he was opening another place. But Mark was so much help with introductions to people. He had a storied, cellarman program too. People sent him people from all over the world to work in their cellars at the White Horse to learn how to do cask conditioned beers and tend them properly. I sent one of my guys. Well, I didn't send him. He sent himself. Dan Byer, he went and worked at the White Horse for, I think, a month or something. But Mark was so helpful with the introductions that he provided to some of these people. And in the years since, I mean, when I was working on the wood book with Peter, I went over and stayed with Mark, and he hooked me up with a bunch of people for that book as well. And anyway, I can't say enough about how helpful Mark was for all that.
That's awesome. I'm gonna ask one more ish question about the books you've written. Now, you just mentioned your wood book with Peter Buchart. Fascinating book. If you don't have it, I'd go out and purchase it. But you did a lot of traveling with Peter Buchart for that book, correct?
Oh yeah. We had a couple of really great trips. I was just telling this story the other day, and I know I've told you this story, but we planned a trip to France to go to Cognac to visit the cooperages that were there so that we could see barrels being made and learn about the different techniques from cooperage to cooperage and see the racks of wood drying and all that kind of stuff. It was a fabulous trip. But, going into it, and Peter was going to bring his whole family, his wife, Freezy, of course, we're great friends too, but his wife, Freezy, and his two boys, Yo and Wout. And they were both, I don't remember exactly how old they were at the time. They were like 12 and 15 or something. They were kind of the geekiest phases that anybody can be, both really good guys. And Wout was our photographer. He took so many of the pictures for the book because he was a serious photographer. But going into it, I said to Kim, why don't you come on this trip? Because that way we'll have a car, they'll have a car, they'll have to be able to have their family unit, we'll have our little unit, but she didn't come. So it was the five of us in one big Volvo station wagon. And so I call that my National Lampoon trip with a vacation with the Von Griswolds. And it was a great trip. Freezy booked really, really good hotels for all of us. She got places with pools so the boys could swim, but I'm a swimmer. So I enjoyed that too. And we had a really terrific trip in France. We also went to Chateau Lafite and Chateau Mouton Rothschild and saw what they did with barrels, that kind of stuff. And then Peter and I also did a trip to Kentucky to visit the cooperages there. And one story I always tell about that one was that we had an appointment at Brown-Forman, which is the biggest sort of industrial cooperage. I don't know, in the world. I don't know, maybe, but we had to see that. Absolutely had to see that. We went to some other more sort of handmade kinds of places that were fascinating as well, but we really wanted to see it sort of a factory setting. And we had an appointment, but the guy with whom I'd made the appointment canceled the night before. We were in Louisville, and he called and said, "Oh, I can't make it." Well, fortunately, my daughter, Lucy, went to college with a guy whose dad worked for Brown-Forman. So I got hold of Lucy and I said, "Can you ask Sterling if his dad can maybe do something for us?" And so that's how we eventually got in, through this secondary contact. And we were able to see, the barrels being charred and assembled by all the weird machinery that they have in cooperages to do that with. It was just fascinating.
That's awesome. Well, Dick, we are just going to take a short break for this message, and then we'll come right back for more of this awesome conversation with you.
All right.
Blue butterfly flower has been used for centuries in Southeast Asian cultures to add bright blues, pinks, and purples to foods and teas. Now brewers and distillers have joined in, using this flavorless flower to infuse new colors into familiar drinks. Ready to make your brews pop with fresh color? Talk with the team at First Tea, and they'll help you find the best way to use blue butterfly and other teas for your next project. Email info@firsttee.com. That's FIRSDTEA.com.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media at Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Malteurop Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropmaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customer success at malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malt Europe, premium grains from field to flavor.
All right, welcome back. We are here with Dick Cantwell talking about cool beer stuff. So Dick, we were talking a little bit about your writing. Obviously before that, your origins in beer. And one thing I'd like to point out is you travel the world now, for business and pleasure. And I've had the luxury of judging beers down in South America with you. What joy, this is gonna be a weird question. What joy do you find in traveling the world, let's say judging or researching beers? What does it bring to you personally?
Well, it's interesting how that whole thing has changed. I mentioned my origins discovering Belgian beer when I was on these art historical trips with my ex-wife before. And, back during those years, of course, we were all taking inspiration from beers that had originated in other countries, Belgium, Germany, Australia, the sparkling ale, Britain, various places all over the place where we would drink these beers and try to emulate them and get ideas and riff off of them. I mean, I remember when I was a home brewer in Cambridge, I had Michael Jackson's, World Guide to Beer, and I would read about all these beers, which fortunately in Massachusetts were pretty widely available. I was able to get nearly everything that he mentioned in those books and try them out. And while I wouldn't, try to necessarily brew a knockoff, I'd certainly get ideas from those. But, over time, of course, the US has become inspirational to the rest of the world with what we've done with our craft brewing movement. And so really the shoe's on the other foot now. And there's been sort of this tennis game with style that's gone from, say, from Belgium to the US, back to Belgium with hoppy beers that they didn't used to make very much of, just different ideas that people take from each other in the friendliest way, of course, and come up with variations on classic styles and newly developed styles. So that's what's been happening over the past 15 years or so, or more even, that a lot of brewers from countries in South America, for example, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, whatever, are taking inspiration from a lot of the things that we've done. I've also traveled around Asia and seen some of the beers that they've come up with that are sort of versions of things that we've done, but with their own touches, that kind of thing. So it's been really, really gratifying and fun over the last 15, 20 years to travel to some of these places and see how their craft scenes have developed. And, the first times I went to some of these places in South America, many of the beers were not that good, partly because they had a really hard time with access to raw materials. They also have issues with being able to count on refrigeration. We can mostly count on refrigeration, though that's been a tough row to hoe as well. But, they just, they were kind of behind the eight ball in many ways. And so their beers, if they were bottle conditioned, they would survive better. But they just couldn't count on a lot of the things that we had come to take for granted, not necessarily take for granted, but that had developed to provide us with great choice and great resources as well. So, you know, as I've been going to all those countries, I've gradually seen their beer scene go up and up and up and up. It's been really cool. And honestly, I think outside of the US, I think the most interesting craft beer scene in the world is in Brazil, with what they're doing with the lightweight sour fruited beers and the really distinctive woods and things like that for flavoring heavy beers like barley wines and stouts. That's a really interesting thing. And Argentina is making wonderful beer. There are terrific breweries there. And I'm looking forward to going back to Chile in a few weeks because it's been several years since I was there checking out their beers. So I'm going back because the Copa de Cerveza de America was always in Santiago, but this year it's in Valdivia, which is a really cool town. So that's really why I'm going back, to see how the beer is and to spend some time in that town. There's so much to be said about that.
Yeah, you know, and that whole scene is, like you said, you've been there going for many years and it is blowing up. And I know I've been down there a few times and there have been some beers and ingredients that have absolutely blown my mind. And this is not a big shocking one, but I think of just all the Amberana beers.
Yeah.
I absolutely, you know, one day hopefully we can truly use it here. But is there, you know, you kind of mentioned Brazil and the sours, but is there one kind of ingredient through your travels that just blew your gourd, really made you think differently?
Yeah, I mean, I would say collectively a lot of those fruits. I mean, the first time I judged in the competition in Blumenau, you know, I didn't really know those fruits because it was, you know, one of my first trips to Brazil. And so I would get the description of the beer and I would turn to a Brazilian maybe and say, what is this? You know, can you tell me about this fruit? And as often as not, they would say, well, actually, that's from the north. I don't really know it either. And so, you know, but over the years, I gradually came to be familiar with these fruits. But my favorite was one year when they actually asked the brewers to submit a sample of the fruit in addition to the beer itself, so that we could taste the fruit and see what contribution it might have made and what it was like. And on another trip down there to Sao Paulo, where I was staying with, or, you know, I was doing a couple of collabs with Brewery Tarantino, with Gilberto Tarantino, Giba, and his crew down there. And he arranged for some really terrific things. We had a tasting with some people who had a company that made specialty wood products of different tropical woods. And we tasted the same beer treated by probably 15 different woods and could pick up on some of the differences in the flavors. Amburana is the most obvious one. And in fact, the woman who was conducting our tasting literally referred to Amburana as the slut of woods because everybody loves her. She's easy. You get an amazing effect from not a whole lot of effort. I don't want to follow that metaphor too far, but another one that I really liked is Castanheira, which is a wood that is the tree that produces Brazil nuts. That's what that wood is, Castanheira. And there are a bunch of other ones. Putumuju is another one. I think I used that in one of the collabs that I did. And we also got to go to, they arranged to drive, it was a couple hours away. It was kind of midway between Sao Paulo and Rio. And we went to this farm it was an orchard, actually. I mean, they had taken what had been pasture land, originally jungle, and cleared to be pasture land. And they had reconverted it to jungle and allowed a lot of these indigenous fruit trees to grow. And so we were literally just walking around the woods, picking fruit off the trees and trying it. And one fruit that was my favorite was called Garcinia. And I've never brewed with it, but I would love to.
Garcinia?
Garcinia.
Garcinia. Cool. Anyway, sorry, I'm writing that down.
So that was a treat, you know, becoming acquainted with all those things. And, you know, it's so great when a brewing scene in some other country makes the most of the ingredients that they have right at their fingertips. That's what Fal was doing with those tropical things from Asia. And that's what they were doing down there in Brazil and Argentina and all over the place. I mean, it's just so cool.
Yeah, I had an interview maybe a couple of months ago from some people down in South America, and they were asking a question where it was, what inspiration do you have for us? What do you think we can do to make cool beers? Because the American craft beer scene. And I said, look around you, because they have access to so many fruits and ingredients that we could never touch on here. But it's incredible the things that they can source. I mean, also for us here, but it's drastically different of the fresh things you're able to put
Well,
into beer.
yeah, it is. I mean, that's one thing I try to do here on our property at the ranch. I've made a number of beers with redwood tips. I've got like 5 pounds of just prime redwood tips in the freezer right now, that I gathered about 3 weeks ago. We have some old persimmon trees. I've made beer with persimmons from that. We've planted an orchard with a bunch of trees here, and I know we're getting a little ahead of it with the barn brewery and all that stuff. But, when those trees start to produce tons of fruit, we're going to have too much, and I'm going to have to brew with it just to use it up. So I'm looking forward to that. But, you can forage anywhere. The first time I went to Argentina, it was during that heady 6 weeks that I worked for ABI. And they wanted me to go down and consult on a brew pub in Bariloche, which, by the way, has the most beautiful view of any brew pub, I have to believe, in the world. It's incredible. But anyway, while we were there, we walked around the property, and I just noticed what was growing there. And the guy who was in charge of all of South America for ABI said, "So I heard that you guys were out around town last night going to some breweries. Did you see anything we should copy?" I was like, "Oh, come on." I said to him, I just saw 3 or 4 ingredients just growing on this property that we could make beer with. That's the way we should be thinking, not whether we can copy what some of the other breweries in the area have done.
So with that statement, there's two more things I want to get to. One is your barn and your brewery, which is amazing. And 2 is I want to talk about the future, your thoughts on the future of beer. So why don't we hear a little bit about your own personal brewery first?
Well, I've got, Kim and I got this property in Occidental in Western Sonoma County about 4 years ago. Actually, tonight we're having a dinner with all of our coworkers here to celebrate the 4th year of our taking over this property. So we built, there was an existing farmhouse here, and we totally remodeled that, and that's where our ranch manager and his family live. And we built a barn and a house. And the barn, I always knew that I wanted to put a small brewery in the barn and invite my brewing cronies to come brew with me, which is what I'm doing, and you'll be there at some point. But I knew I wanted to have a sweet little brewing system, so I arranged to get a 1-barrel, 3-vessel system from SS Brewtech, and it's the smallest system they make that has a calandria in the kettle. I have sloped floors, trench drain, and I was just going to do sort of a bare bones room, but Kim was like, "Come on, let's do this right." So I've got tiled walls, and it's just a beautiful. I mean, I'm in the barn right now. I can see it right over there. So it's nicer than at least a couple of the systems that I had at Elysian, but it's only 1 barrel. And so far, I've had a succession of illustrious assistant brewers. My first assistant brewer was Vinny Chilurzo from Russian River, and Sean O'Sullivan came up from 21st Amendment. Fal came down from Anderson Valley to brew with me. Just last week, I had Whitney Burnside from Grand Fir. She came down. We brewed a Japanese rice lager that we're putting yuzu in. I just dumped a bottle of yuzu extract in it a few minutes ago. But so that's the idea. And, I think as I said, it's a 1-barrel system. It's more beer than we can drink. So when I have beer that I can give away, I'm putting a flag out on the road. So far, I've only done it once. Put a flag out on the road. Anybody who knows what the flag means, come in, fill a growler, sit and have a beer, whatever. And, I'm not charging any money for it or anything like that. I can't, and nor do I want to, nor do I need to. So that's my plan for getting rid of my excess beer. And my plan for creating all that beer is to have people, my friends like you, come brew with me and put our heads together and decide what to do, and hopefully have a delicious result.
Now, I know you've invited Lee Lord and I to do that, and we've threatened you with a gummy worm milkshake.
Yeah, that's not happening.
We won't do that. Yeah. We'll make a real one. If you're inclined, could you maybe let the listeners know what or if there's a history of the beer flag?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it is referential to, like I know in Europe, they would sometimes put a broom out if there was beer available from like a farmhouse brewery. But where I really remember seeing it is in Peru, the chicherias. If they have chicha to sell, they put a flag out. And so you're driving along and you see all these sort of red flags hanging out from these little farmhouse chicherias. And that's really cool. And so that's my idea. The first time I did it, I, let people know that I had done it. I don't have people trained yet, but eventually I figure it'll have sort of a rhythm to it. And, but yeah, I'm tying in with that. And Kim's younger son, Nick, did my graphic design for the brewery, and I call my brewery Old Growth Brewing. And so he did all the graphics for it, and he's going to design a flag with this sort of tree dude on it that'll hang out there, and I'm hoping that people will come to recognize what that means.
That is so cool. So you've hung the flag, or you put the flag out once, and you said people have shown up. How did that go? Was it fun?
Oh yeah, it was fun. I mean, mostly it was people from the construction crews that built the buildings here. So it was people that I, really enjoyed hanging out with anyway. And they brought friends. And, we mostly just sat around and drank beer. And then people took growlers home with them when they left. But that's the idea. And I actually kind of borrowed that idea from a guy named Richard Hay Brewer, who had a home brewery in Noe Valley in San Francisco. And he did exactly that. He would invite people in to drink his beer for free because he didn't have a license. So you can't sell it if you don't have a license. So he would invite people in to drink his beer for free. And it became so popular that San Francisco Magazine named it one of the best new breweries of the year one year. And that was when authorities showed up thinking that he was running an illegal brewery. But so anyway, so I borrowed some of that idea from him.
That is so cool. Great. I'm excited to brew and to also drink some of your concoctions someday. And then I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, Dick, but my last question for you, because you've been around, you've seen the world, you've had all types of beers. How are you feeling about the future of craft beer in the US, but just in general, I suppose? I mean, because it's crazy around the world. So
I think collectively, the craft beer scene remains healthy. I do think that there's such competition with as many breweries as there are, and the various other beverages there are out there for younger people to become accustomed to drinking. So I know there's definitely sort of the sky is falling feeling about a lot of aspects of it. But as I said, I think collectively, we're going to continue to see wonderful and innovative beers from a succession of new brewers who will, over the years, replace each other. I am a little concerned. I am concerned about, many of my friends who have been in the industry for a long time who either, if they own their breweries, may not realize what they hoped to. I mean, I don't think any of us really got into this. I can't say any of us, but I know I didn't get into the whole idea of craft brewing because I thought it was going to make me a ton of money. I just thought it was really cool that maybe I could get a job making beer, and maybe support myself doing that. And I think that's how most people get into it, is you just suddenly get passionate about it. You want to throw yourself into it, do as many things as you possibly can to come up with interesting ideas and all that. But I am concerned about the well-being of many of my friends, that they may not be able to get anything from the breweries that they've spent 2 or 3 decades building and, operating. And then there are many people who don't necessarily own the breweries, people who are the face of their breweries, but who will presumably, I hope, have some sort of a plan for retirement in place. But that's really what I worry about. I mean, I think the scene will be okay. Yes, there are challenges, there are headwinds and all that kind of stuff. But you know, we all still speak the same language about innovation and coming up with new ideas. We still all share our information with each other. It's still really, really friendly for the most part. And you know, it's been a terrific thing to do for the last, I mean, gosh, I guess I got my first brewing job in 1990, so that was almost 35 years ago. And it's been an amazing time. And I think it will continue to be amazing, but it'll be a bit more difficult. One thing I have noticed too is that there are an awful lot of people just jumping from home brewing into having a professional brewery, and they don't necessarily have the awareness of many of the practical aspects that those of us who have been around for a long time have really fought for and maintained. So sometimes that's a little bit frustrating to observe, but I think as long as people are willing to step back and recognize that a lot of people have been doing this for quite a while, and that there are certain things that have made it such a wonderful thing to have done and to be a part of, that are really important for them to recognize and to maintain going into the future.
There's hope.
Oh, of course there's hope.
All right, Dick. Well, thank you for your time today. I know you are an inspiration to me and many, many, many people in the brewing industry, and your time is valuable. So we can't thank you enough for that. Yeah, and it was wonderful hearing your insight and stories. So I hope the listeners also had a wonderful journey. Dick will be back on the next episode of the show as the host, having a conversation with a brewer of his choosing. And that will air in about 2 weeks. So make sure you tune in for that. And then a reminder is visit allaboutbeer.com and follow on social media to support journalism in the beer space. Check out patreon.com/allaboutbeer. And again, I'm Kelly McKnight from New Belgium Brewing. We were with Dick Cantwell, and thank you for listening to the Brewer to Brewer podcast.
Well, thanks a lot. That was fun.
First Tea is a proud sponsor of the Brewer to Brewer podcast. First Tea invites you to explore the rich and versatile world of teas and botanicals, including blue butterfly flower. Email info@firsttea.com to find out more. That's FIRSDTEA.com.
For more than a decade, the Beer Law Center has been dedicated to the craft beverage industry, meeting the legal needs of breweries, wineries, distilleries, and all manner of alcohol producers and sellers around the country. From company formation to federal and state licensing, trademarks, regulations, and compliance, or if you're buying or selling an alcohol business, the Beer Law Center should be your first call. The firm never charges for an initial consultation, and if they can't help you, they'll help you find someone that can. Have a legal question? Contact the Beer Law Center on social media @Beer Law Center and online at beerlawcenter.com.
Malt Europe Malting Company is based in North America, specializing in growing and producing quality malts for the craft beer and distilling industries. With local farms and malt houses spread across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, MMC's commitment to excellence is fully ingrained into every batch it produces, ensuring breweries and distilleries of any size can create the finest beverages on the planet. Visit malteuropemaltingco.com to learn how Malt Europe can support your malting needs. Or you can contact them at customer success@malteurope.com or call 844-546-MALT for questions or to place your order. Malt Europe, premium grains from field to flavor.